Okay, welcome class to another edition of lectures on second language acquisition. Today we're going to be working out of the next chapter, which I believe is chapter 2, about first language acquisition. We're going to be going over some of the theories in first language acquisition, a little bit of the history there. We'll also look at some issues in in first language acquisition, and then we're going to look at how first language acquisition is applied to language teaching. There's a whole bunch of deep concepts in here, so if you do feel overwhelmed, please stop the video, go back and listen to it again. All right? Let's move on here right away to some of the theories. We're going to start with the oldest theory first, and these are some of the more traditional, more steeped in materialistic science, and this is the behavioral approaches by B.F. Skinner. He wrote a book a while ago, I think it was in the 50s or 60s, entitled Verbal Behavior, and this text was basically saying that the brain was completely empty when it was born. It was a blank slate, and that the only way that you learned things was through conditioning, operant conditioning, stimulus response type of thing, you know, like with Pavlov's dogs, stimulus and then rewards type of thing. And so that was the idea that he would bring along in this book. And that's the way it was supposed to be, because there was no mind involved. There was no pre-planning involved. It was kind of like the concept of random chance out of Darwinian evolution, where everything just happened kind of by chance. And the same idea was kind of being applied here, where you have this blank slate, and it's just through this stimulus response that everything is built in. Enter some of the challengers to the behavioral approach, and that would be Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky brings to this idea a whole bunch of evidence that says we're not a blank slate, that says that the brain has a whole bunch of things involved already, even before we learn to say anything, that the brain is hardwired with certain capabilities that allow us to learn language. There are certain rules that are put in here, right? So today, no one agrees that a behavioral approach adequately accounts for the capacity to acquire language. The brain is unique in that ability to acquire language. Now, at some point after Chomsky started saying, look, the brain has this ability, it's got an ability to organize, it has the ability to synthesize and store linguistic information, you know, and there had to be some abilities sitting in there before. And so what happens is they come up with this idea of mediation theory. Mediation theory is basically, hey, the brain is self-organizing. The brain is self-stimulating so that it can learn these things. It can begin to make patterns and put things into play. This idea was a covert process. In other words, the brain didn't know that it was doing it. It was an invisible process. However, this concept of mediation theory is actually, destroying their own desire. You see, the behavioralist wanted to find a completely physical, non-mental way of trying to describe how the brain develops, how the mind develops from the brain, and that there's no spiritual, that there's no personality per se. Although they wouldn't say personality, okay? But with the introduction of mediation theory, you have the introduction of a mind. And of course, if you have a mind, where does the mind come from? It's not just the sum of its parts. And so that was a problem there with mediation. The other problem is the whole concept of random chance for the development and storage and organization of all this is far beyond the realm of scientific probability, and that's what science does its research on. It does its research on the probability that something is going to happen randomly, or that it's going to happen at all, or it's going to happen at all, or there's going to be an intelligent agent doing it. Regardless, the numbers were too small. So mediation theory was in trouble the minute it was put out there. Chomsky, as I said, brings about this idea of the brain having innate abilities, and this was called the nativist approach. There are things in the brain that allows language to be acquired. Language acquisition is innately determined. It's within the brain, right? It's innately determined. Man is born with a genetic capacity to systematically perceive outside and build a language system in the brain. So the brain has this ability within the genes to perceive things and to build a language system in the brain. Where does it get that ability? That ability is hardwired in the system. So Chomsky tried to describe what these rules are. It's all, conceptual, and he tried to put it in some framework that could be more easily understood. And so he developed this idea, the concept of a language acquisition device. It's not a real device. It's not in a certain part of your brain, but it's this ability that we have, and it appears to be some kind of, device-like thing. It's actually not located in any one place in your brain. It's just the abilities of the brain that the brain has. There are 4 points. 1, Chomsky's LAD describes the ability to distinguish speech sounds from other sounds. Now, your brain has the ability to do that. For example, when I was living in Japan, and I'm on a train car. I'm in a train car. I'm not on a train car. I'm in a train car, and I'm listening to all these people around me speaking in Japanese, and all of a sudden, at the far end of the train car, someone gets on who speaks English, and I immediately can hear those sounds all the way at the other end. Even though there's all this other quote-unquote noise going on, these Japanese speakers, I can hear that English because my ear is attuned to it. I can distinguish between Japanese and other. I can distinguish between the wind and other. You can distinguish from me going, or maybe I come over here and I make some noise, and you realize your brain can distinguish between the speech sounds and other sounds. 2, the ability to organize linguistic data into various classes that can later be defined. And so the brain has the ability to do that. And it's got this hardwired ability to say, okay, this is a word, this isn't a word, this is this kind of word, this is that kind of word, and you can break it down, and of course later on you can refine them. Let me just give you a funny example that I saw online about this little girl who has learned what pronouns are, although she hasn't been able to use them all exactly. So this is a cute little video clip that I hope you enjoy.
Where are you right now? Where? It's Miami. No, Miami. You gotta say Miami. You say Miami. Alex, the word is Miami. Miami. Okay, it's your Amy. Yeah. It's your Amy. There you go. Give me 5.
What I find interesting about this is there's this little girl. Nobody told her, nobody explained to her. What is she, 2, 3 years old? And yet she has in her brain already this subclass of pronouns. She already understands what they are. Again, she's not using them properly, but nobody trained her about those. Okay, she couldn't. She just learned what they were. You have that innate ability. Number 3, knowledge that only a certain kind of linguistic system is possible. Notice that these little kids, as they're growing and they're learning, they're putting things in the proper places. They're developing a system for which they can communicate. They've learned that it's a code to transmit meaning. And there's only certain systems that are possible. Number 4, the ability to engage in constant evaluation of the developing linguistic system to construct the simplest possible system from the available linguistic input. So they are starting to develop a simple system at a very young age. And they're using it, and the way they do that is by analyzing. They hear and analyze, hear and analyze, hear and analyze. Your brain does the same thing. Did you ever hear yourself say something, and after you say it, you go, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. I meant something else. It's a scene from, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the original version with Gene Wilder, where he says there's so much time and so little to do. And then he wait, turn that around. So little time and so much to do. But he analyzed that. He evaluated it as he was going. He heard himself say it, and he said, "Whoa, I got to do that again," because he could check the system. Kids are doing that as they learn. They're constantly self-analyzing the things that are going on around them, conversation to them, and of course the stuff that they hear. The little girl we just saw, she didn't pick up the difference between a place name and the pronoun yet, but she's analyzing. That's why, she has the rule on her head. It's wrong. She had the rule on her head. And so she was analyzing even as she was going along. Rather interesting. Other concepts in this nativist approach is the concept of a universal grammar. The belief that the linguistic rules that all humanity have is genetically equipped. All humanity is genetically equipped with those rules that will enable them to acquire language regardless of their linguistic environment. In other words, they're going to be able to learn regardless of where they are. Children in every culture who learn any language learn language at about the same age, whether it's Chinese or whether it's French, whether it's Ubuntu, which isn't a language, I don't think, but it doesn't matter what the language is. They're all going to learn language about the same time, because the rules for them to learn them, the rules in their head that have been hardwired in there, are going to allow them to do that at basically the same. So this is another point, a child's language at every stage of development is a legitimate system. So when you have these little kids and they say, Daddy Cup, that's a full system. That's actually what's in the book here that's called pivot grammar, where kids begin to develop a rudimentary language system that agrees with English, okay, and then they develop it further on as they go. But when they begin, they have a very limited system. So they'll say things like, just one word. They'll start out with one word, cup. They'll reach and they'll cup and they'll reach out and they want a cup. Want cup. Me drink. And then they'll put in two words and they'll have a subject and a verb and it'll be in the right order. So they're going to have that at any age, any stage of that development. It's a legitimate system. It's a system they're trying to use to communicate, right? Quite an interesting development as you see it go in kids. And if you have the opportunity, take your time and start watching what kids do and how they learn, how their language develops. Okay, Chomsky comes, and just like Skinner and his group of behaviorism, there came other people who wanted to challenge the nativist approach. And so some people came out and they said, look, the rule-governed model is more than just a series of events, a series of rules. Children are not learning and acquiring language because they're using one rule after another rule after another rule. No, it's not a single process. It's probably 3, 4, 10, 20 different things that are going on at the same time. And I would have to agree, just as Spolsky suggested here, that we should have an idea of something that's called parallel distributed processing, or PDP, where you have a variety of things that are processing at the same time, doing a variety of things. A child's linguistic performance may be the consequence of many levels of simultaneous neural interconnections rather than a serial process. And I would completely agree. I actually have never heard of anyone try to say that what Chomsky was doing was serial, in other words, one after another, but so that this could work as well. And so I would probably agree that the brain is able to do that. After all, when you are sitting here listening, you're sitting and listening, and your heart is still beating, and you're breathing, and you may be having thoughts, and something starts itching, and so you scratch your knee or whatever. You have all these things that are going on at the same time. Why wouldn't it be the same for language learning and language development in your first language? Another challenge that came out was the concept of all the connections that are in the brain. And that there is this system in the brain that as it's trying to make these connections, there are a whole bunch of neurons that are connecting up. And the ones that are used more are going to get stronger and eventually become the main. And then the ones that are weaker are falling away. I don't know that you realize, but that when a little baby is beginning to develop, there are hundreds of thousands of neural connections that are happening all the time. In order to make those connections, the body needs a whole bunch of special proteins. And those proteins exist in a kid until around 10 or 12 or 13 years old, and then those proteins, they go away. So if a kid is in an accident and part of his brain needs to be taken out, he's going to fare much better than somebody who is an adult and part of their brain has to be taken out. And the reason for it is, if you take out a part of the brain, the synapses that are growing, all those proteins are still there. They're just going to try to reroute what they were trying to do. Okay, when you're older, you don't have those proteins, and so there's no rerouting going on. The proteins are the machines that build all of those neural connections. And so this idea that you have multiple connections and the stronger ones become the mainstay and the weaker ones, because they're used less, they fall away, is very true. I've read articles where when the brain, the optic nerve, is trying to connect to the rest of the brain, there are a variety of nerves that try to vie for that. And when one is being used over and over again, the other ones that aren't used are used less, and they eventually die away. So the brain is trying to always have redundant systems going on in the brain. Connectionism makes sense in that vein. Redundant systems are very prevalent in the body. You have two hands. You don't need two necessarily. You've got two lungs, two kidneys, and so you have these redundant systems. If one breaks down, you still have another. Obviously, it's better to have two. It's better to have two eyes and two ears, but you don't need them nearly as much. Okay, so that's the concept of connectionism. And I don't know that necessarily takes away from anything that Chomsky was saying, other than the fact that people would then use that with this concept of emergentism. Which, for example, O'Grady had talks about, where they talk about a complex system that emerges out of a plethora of simpler systems, because there are so many neurons that are going on here. From this simple neurons, from this tremendous growth, out of it develops this complex system. And so what O'Grady is trying to do, O'Grady and others with emergentism, is they're trying to say we have a complex linguistic system in the brain that does not require the pre-planning, the language acquisition device, or a mind. Okay? It just emerges out of it. So where does language come from? A theist will say language comes from some other mind, aka God. But with an emergent idea, no, it just emerges out of what's simple. I find it interesting that there are people who are trying to espouse this, and yet the laws of thermodynamics can clearly indicate that things break down in complexity, not become more complex. But that's another discussion. Emergentism was a way to try to challenge the nativist, the rules in your head, the language acquisition device, all of these things that point to something that's pre-programmed, and what pre-programmed it, possibly being another mind, okay, aka God. All right, some conclusions. At the beginning, when you look back at the behavioralist approach, they were trying to use a very, very scientific approach. There is no mind, there is only matter, there is only material, and there is nothing else that's in. And when they stepped away from that hard scientific method, researchers began to explore other things, more abstract things in the areas of language acquisition, and that was a good thing. The scientific, materialistic only method was limiting what they could do. Some will say, hey, the language acquisition device points to another mind. The pre-programming points to God. Some others would say, I don't care what it points to. It's going to help me better explain what's here. Okay, and let's just focus on that. So, leaving the scientific method, the hard scientific method, was actually a benefit. Certain ideas described in universal grammar gave researchers a better understanding of language acquisition and human language in general. Because although there have been research on languages with other species, human language is clearly distinct from all others in their capacity to be able to organize and structure and learn language in about the same period of time. Okay, another conclusion here is that the systematic development is thought to be, the language that's developed in the brain is thought to be rule-governed, Okay, again, we go back to the language acquisition device. It's rule-governed. It may operate in a parallel distributed processing, which I would probably agree with, and may be the result of experimental neural connections, or emergentism with connectionism, which I probably would not espouse. It makes more sense to think that the parallel distributed processing and the rule-governed system that's in the brain are the instructions that are in the DNA. That makes more sense, at least from my vantage point. All right, let's move on from there. A new thing that came after Skinner, a new thing that came after Chomsky and the nativist approach was emerged from the 1980s, 90s, and now is the idea of a constructivist approach. It's the belief that language requires the stuff that's going on in the brain, but it also requires social interaction. So language is just one way the mind grapples with the world and others and itself. So the mind, it has all these rules and all these systems inside, but it needs input. And it's got to deal with all the stimulus that it gets from outside. One of those things being how it interacts with other people. The nativist approach focuses on the rules of language, okay? Especially the rules that are going on inside, as far as how language is formed. But it does not address the meanings, right, constructed in a social environment. And so language is something that's built. It's not inherent in the kid's head. He's got to build that understanding. And so that requires a social interaction. And so the functional approach, or the constructivist approach, is talking about how language is built and developed in a community, and that it's something that has to be built up. Okay, so one of the criticisms for the nativist approach, for example, is this example here where someone says, well, you can describe the meaning, mommy sock. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean this is mommy sock? Does this mean mommy, I need a sock? You won't know unless you understand the context in which it's in. And so context is going to play a role there. So describing mommy sock as, for example, a pivot sentence may not make any sense, because you're providing meaning for this kid without understanding what's going on. Who's the master of the language? Is it the little kid? Is it the group? Is it language? You see, language is not developed in a vacuum, and that we need that other person in order to make language possible. We have the rules in the head, but we also need the other. Okay, some more thoughts about language learning. Where am I here? One is that semantic learning depends on cognitive development. Understanding what's going on within the language, the semantic elements, in it, as far as the meanings behind all the words that are being said. For example, I say to you, things are looking up. You don't look up. I mean, it has a different meaning because of the context that you're in. So the semantic learning depends on cognitive development. You have to have a functioning brain with all of its proper neurons to understand more of the semantics that's going on. The example of the little girl that we saw earlier about Miami and your Amy. Well, her cognitive development was not as such that you can understand the semantics of what Daddy was trying to do. Functional language development depends on the growth of the conceptual and communicative abilities, as well as the stuff that's already in the brain, the rules, the LAD, the language acquisition device. You need both. Okay? So formal language development depends on perceptual and information processing abilities. I need to be able to process the information, and that's what more of the nativist idea is. And I need to be able to process and perceive what's going on. I need to be able to understand what's going on, back to the semantic idea. And have the innate schema of grammar in the brain, the LAD. I need both. Therefore, social interaction and language development are tied together. Language development is more than just the rules, okay? Rules generating capabilities. It's also socially developed. I hope you're understanding. I need the stuff in my brain, the rules, the ability to organize linguistic information. I need that, but I also need that social interaction so that I can construct meaning. And so for that, we're thankful for the constructivist approaches. All right, here are your, actually it's three main concepts here, three main theories. You've got your behavioralist, you've got your nativist, and you have your functional. Those are the three main ones. This mediation is actually part of a response to the nativists that came out, and they were trying to protect the behavioralist approaches, but it really didn't go too far. Your three main ones are the nativist, the behavioralist, and then the functional. The last two having a great impact. Okay, the next series of things that I want to talk about here are the issues in first language acquisition. There are a whole bunch of concepts that are going on here, but I'm going to stop right here, and we'll take a little break, and you guys can come back later and see the other stuff. Talk to you soon.